Ethan Lancaster had everything: youth, power, and an empire built on ruthless ambition. He had grown up believing that love was secondary to success, that emotions were a liability in the high-stakes world of business. His marriage to Ava was never meant to be a grand romance. She was kind-hearted, devoted, and undeniably beautiful, but most importantly, she had been easy to control, or so he thought. When he met her, she was working at a small bookstore, living a quiet life that stood in stark contrast to his. Ethan had been drawn to her innocence, her ability to see the world in colors he had long forgotten. At first, he convinced himself that marrying her was an act of generosity, rescuing her from a life of financial struggle. But as the years passed, he grew restless. Ava loved Ethan with every fiber of her being. She had never been naive about his world, but she had hoped that, in time, he would see her as his equal rather than just a wife who blended into the background of his luxurious life. She never cared about his wealth, the grand mansions, or the expensive gifts he barely bothered to give her. All she wanted was for him to love her the way she loved him. But Ethan was always too busy, too consumed by work, social engagements, and the pressure of being a self-made millionaire. His affection, if it ever existed, was fleeting, like a candle flickering in a storm. And then came Helena. Helena Moreau was everything Ava wasn't: bold, sophisticated, and cunning. She was the kind of woman who understood Ethan's hunger for dominance, who fed into his ego with calculated admiration. It didn't take long for Ethan to fall into her web, convincing himself that what he felt for Helena was something deeper, something real. The affair started subtly: stolen glances, whispered conversations at exclusive parties, but soon, it became impossible to hide. Ava wasn't blind. She had seen the shift in Ethan long before the rumors reached her. He stopped coming home early, his gaze no longer lingered on her, and the warmth in his voice disappeared, replaced by cold indifference. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows of their penthouse, Ava confronted him. She stood in the dimly lit living room, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "Ethan, are you in love with her?" Her words cut through the silence, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, maybe. But then, as if switching back to the man he had become, he scoffed. "Love? Ava, let's not pretend. We were never really in love, were we? You were convenient. But Helena, she understands me." Convenient. That single word shattered whatever was left of Ava's heart. She had given everything to this man: her dreams, her trust, her very soul. And now, she was nothing more than a passing phase, a mistake to be discarded. Ethan didn't even bother to offer an apology. Instead, he handed her divorce papers, cold and clinical, as if she were just another contract to be signed and forgotten. "I've already made the arrangements. You'll be taken care of financially," he said, as though throwing her scraps. Ava stared at the papers, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She had dreamed of a future with him, of children, of growing old together. But that future had never existed. Not in his mind. Without another word, she took the papers, signed them without hesitation, and walked out of his life. Ethan watched her leave, expecting to feel relief. Instead, there was an unsettling emptiness, but he quickly buried it beneath arrogance. He had Helena now. He had the life he truly wanted. Or so he thought. But fate had other plans. Ava disappeared without a trace, vanishing from the world they once shared. And for years, Ethan never gave her another thought. That is, until she returned, standing at his doorstep with a child that looked eerily like him. Ethan Lancaster was not a man who dwelled on the past. To him, regrets were for the weak, and looking back was a distraction from the future. His life had only improved since leaving Ava. Or, at least, that was what he told himself. His relationship with Helena had been a whirlwind of passion, luxury, and excitement, exactly what he thought he wanted. But as time passed, the novelty faded. Helena was high maintenance, demanding, and most of all, selfish in ways he had never noticed before. What he once found intoxicating now felt suffocating. Still, His pride kept him from admitting his mistake. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Ava had been a chapter in his life that had ended cleanly. He never sought her out, never wondered where she had gone. She had signed the divorce papers and vanished. That was the closure he needed. But tonight, as he stood frozen in the doorway of his grand estate, staring at the woman he had so easily discarded, a long-forgotten unease crawled up his spine. Ava was different now. The timid, heartbroken woman he had abandoned was gone. In her place stood someone unshaken by his presence. Her posture was poised, her eyes sharp, and though she wore no expensive jewelry or designer clothes, there was something undeniably powerful about her. She wasn't the same woman who had walked out of his life years ago. But it wasn't just Ava's presence that unsettled him. It was the child beside her. A little boy, no older than 3, with striking blue eyes, his eyes. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the weight of realization slammed into him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Ava's expression remained unreadable as she finally spoke. "I believe we need to talk." For the first time in years, Ethan felt powerless. He stepped aside, allowing them into the house. His mansion was a symbol of his success, every detail meticulously designed to impress, from the grand chandelier hanging above them to the marble floors that reflected the golden glow of the lights. But Ava didn't seem fazed by any of it. She had once lived here, after all. Instead, she glanced around with the faintest trace of nostalgia before her gaze settled on him. Ethan led them into his study, where the air was thick with unspoken words. He took a seat behind his large mahogany desk, a subconscious attempt to assert control, but it felt hollow. Ava, however, remained standing, her hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. He couldn't take his eyes off the child, his son. Finally, he found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Explain." Ava's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You left me, Ethan. You handed me divorce papers like I was nothing more than a transaction. You never asked if I was okay. You never checked on me. Did you ever wonder what happened after I walked out that door?" His jaw tightened. He had convinced himself that Ava had moved on, that she had found someone else or chosen a quiet life far away from his world. The idea that she had been carrying his child while he was parading around with Helena made his stomach turn. "I didn't know," he admitted. Her gaze sharpened. "Would it have changed anything if you did?" Silence. Ethan wasn't sure how to answer that. Would he have left Helena? Would he have fought for Ava? The truth was, he had been too consumed by his own desires to consider the consequences of his actions. "I had nothing," she continued, her voice steady, but laced with an edge of pain. "You walked away with your wealth, your reputation, your perfect life. Meanwhile, I was alone, pregnant, and forced to start over from nothing. But I did it, Ethan. I built a life for myself and my son. Without you." The boy, his son, clutched Ava's hand, looking up at her with innocent curiosity. He had no idea who Ethan was. Ethan exhaled, trying to process everything. He had always prided himself on being in control, on dictating every aspect of his life. But this was beyond anything he had anticipated. "What's his name?" he finally asked. Ava hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Leo. Leo." The name echoed in his mind, foreign yet familiar. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. He had a son, a child who had grown up without his father, without even the knowledge of his existence. And whose fault was that? His gaze lifted to Ava. "Why are you here now?" She held his stare, unwavering. "Because Leo deserves to know the truth." Ethan's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure if it was fear, anger, or something else entirely. The past he had buried was no longer in the past. It was standing right in front of him, forcing him to face the consequences of his choices. For the first time in years, Ethan Lancaster, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who had prided himself on never looking back, found himself utterly lost. And he wasn't sure if he could find his way out of this one. Ethan's mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. His life had been structured, calculated, and efficient, until this moment. He was used to controlling the narrative, to ensuring that nothing caught him off guard. Yet here he was, facing the one woman he had discarded, the one woman he had thought was nothing more than a forgotten chapter in his past. And now, she had returned with a child who was undeniably his. His eyes kept drifting to the boy, Leo. The child was silent, clutching Ava's hand with small fingers, his wide blue eyes filled with curiosity but no recognition. That stung more than Ethan wanted to admit. His own son didn't know who he was. How could he? He had never been there. Ava remained poised, her expression unreadable as she waited for him to process everything. She had always been like this, patient, quiet, but unshakable when it mattered. And now, she was here, standing before him not as the naive woman he had left behind, but as someone who had survived without him. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. Why now, Ava? Why bring him here after all this time?
She didn't hesitate.
Because he deserves to know the truth. And because I want to hear it from you. What are you going to do about this, Ethan? His jaw clenched.
She was right to ask.
What was he going to do? He was a man who made decisions in boardrooms, who dealt with high-stakes negotiations on a daily basis. Yet now, faced with the consequences of his own actions, he felt paralyzed. He looked at Leo again. The boy was studying him, his expression cautious but not fearful. There was something unnerving about being assessed by his own child, a child he hadn't even known existed until minutes ago. Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower now. Does he know who I am? Ava's gaze didn't waver. No. That one word was like a punch to the gut. He had a son who didn't even know his name. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. I assume you want money. Support. It was a defensive statement, but he wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe because offering money was easier than dealing with the emotions that came with this situation. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line. Do you really think that's why I came here? Ethan held her gaze, but said nothing. Her voice was calm, controlled. I don't need your money, Ethan. I never did. I built a life for us without you. Leo has everything he needs. But what he doesn't have is answers. Ethan felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Ava had always been different from the women he surrounded himself with. She had never cared about his wealth, his power. That had been part of why he had chosen her in the first place, because she was untainted by the greed he so often encountered. But that same independence had also been what made it so easy for him to leave. He had assumed she would be fine, that she would move on, that his absence wouldn't matter. But it had mattered. Not to Ava, she had survived. But to Leo? Ethan had stolen something from his own son without even realizing it. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his desk. What do you want from me, Ava? She didn't hesitate. I want you to be honest with me. If you want nothing to do with him, say it now. If you regret nothing, say it now. Because I refuse to let you come in and out of his life on a whim. He deserves stability, not a father who only acknowledges him when it's convenient. Her words cut deep. Ethan wasn't sure what he had expected her to say, but it wasn't that. The idea of walking away, of pretending this moment never happened, was tempting in its simplicity. But the longer he looked at Leo, the more he realized that wasn't an option. This boy, his son, was here, real, undeniable. He had missed his first steps, his first words, his first everything. And that realization made something inside him shift, something he wasn't ready to name. Ethan exhaled, his voice quieter now. I don't know how to do this, Ava. Ava's expression softened just a fraction. Then start by trying. Silence stretched between them. Ethan had spent years convincing himself that he had made the right decision in leaving Ava, that she had been holding him back, that he had been justified in chasing a life with Helena. But now, staring at the result of his choices, he wasn't so sure anymore. Helena. The thought of her made his stomach twist. How would she react to this? She had always been possessive, always demanding his full attention. And if there was one thing Helena despised, it was competition. As if reading his mind, Ava spoke again. She doesn't know, does she? Ethan's silence was answer enough. Ava's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I thought so. She straightened, her hand still resting protectively on Leo's shoulder. I won't force you to be a father, Ethan. But if you choose to walk away now, understand that this is your last chance. I won't come back. Leo won't come back. Ethan stared at her, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. She wasn't bluffing. This was a one-time opportunity, and he knew it. Leo shifted slightly, his small fingers gripping Ava's sleeve as he whispered, "Mommy, can we go now?" Something in Ethan's chest tightened at the word. Mommy. Ava had done this all on her own. She had raised their son, protected him, given him everything he needed without a single ounce of help from him. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Lancaster felt the crushing weight of his own mistakes. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could fix them. Ethan Lancaster had built an empire from the ground up, yet standing in his own home, staring at the woman he had abandoned and the child he had unknowingly fathered, he felt like a man with nothing. He had spent years convincing himself that leaving Ava had been the right decision, that trading stability for excitement, loyalty for ambition, had been worth it. But as he watched her walk toward the door, gripping their son's tiny hand, something inside him snapped. Ava, wait. The words left his lips before he could stop them. He wasn't even sure what he was going to say next, but he knew he couldn't let her leave. Not like this. She paused, turning just enough to look at him over her shoulder. Leo clung to her side, his small face partially hidden behind her coat. He wasn't afraid of Ethan, but there was a hesitation in his eyes that stung more than outright fear would have. Ethan took a slow step forward. I don't want you to go. Ava arched a brow, unimpressed.
Why?
Because your pride won't let you walk away from something that belongs to you. His jaw tightened at the accusation, but she wasn't wrong. He had spent so long seeing the world through the lens of ownership and power that he had almost reduced his own son to a possession, something he suddenly wanted just because he had learned of his existence. I want to know him, Ethan said, forcing himself to meet Ava's gaze. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to believe me. But I can't pretend he doesn't exist, Ava. For the first time, Ava's expression faltered. It was slight, but he saw it, the flicker of uncertainty, of exhaustion. She had been strong for too long. Leo tugged at her sleeve. Mommy, I'm sleepy. Ava sighed softly, smoothing a hand over the boy's hair. Her fingers trembled slightly. We should go. Ethan's mind raced. He had spent years ignoring Ava's existence, yet the thought of her disappearing again, taking a son with her, was unbearable. He couldn't let her walk out of his life a second time. At least let me take you home, he said quickly. It's late. I'll have a driver bring you, wherever you're staying. Ava hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Fine. The ride was silent. Ethan sat beside her in the back of his sleek black car, the city lights casting moving shadows across Ava's face. Leo had dozed off in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder. Ethan forced himself to look away. He had no right to feel anything about this, about the way Ava cradled their son with such quiet strength, about the life she had built without him. When they finally arrived at her apartment, Ethan felt another shock. He had expected something modest, but the building was expensive, well-maintained. She hadn't just survived, she had thrived. Ava shifted Leo in her arms, careful not to wake him as she stepped out of the car. Ethan followed without thinking. She gave him a wary glance. What are you doing? I want to see where my son lives. Ava hesitated, but eventually she sighed and walked ahead. Her apartment was elegant, but not overly extravagant. It was warm, lived in, filled with small details Ethan had never imagined for her, a bookshelf overflowing with novels, a framed photo of Leo on a beach, a small collection of toys in the corner. This was her life. A life he had never been part of. She carefully laid Leo down in his bed, tucking him in before stepping out of the room and shutting the door behind her. When she turned back to Ethan, her expression was unreadable. Say what you need to say, she said quietly. Ethan exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. I made a mistake. Ava let out a bitter laugh. Which one? Leaving me? Marrying Helena? Or waiting 3 years before realizing you have a son? He swallowed. All of it. Ava crossed her arms. And what do you want me to do with that, Ethan? Say I forgive you? Hand Leo over, so you can parade him around like another one of your acquisitions. No, he said quickly. I don't know how to fix this. Ava. She studied him for a long moment. That's the problem, Ethan. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. Some choices have consequences. And you don't get to waltz back in and erase the past just because it's inconvenient now. He flinched. She was right. But that didn't change the fact that he couldn't walk away. Let me see him, Ethan said. Not just tonight. I want to be in his life. Ava looked at him, really looked at him, as if searching for any sign of deception. Finally, she exhaled. We'll see. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And for the first time in years, Ethan Lancaster felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The days that followed were an agonizing mix of anticipation and silence. Ethan found himself thinking about Leo constantly, imagining his son's face in every fleeting moment of his day. He wasn't the kind of man who spent his time contemplating the things he couldn't change, but this felt different. For the first time in his life, he couldn't control the outcome. His decisions had already shaped his reality, and now, all he could do was wait for Ava's next move. Helena, of course, noticed the shift in him. She had always been perceptive, attuned to every change in Ethan's demeanor, even the subtle ones he tried to hide. But this time, she wasn't the only one who could sense the change. His employees, his colleagues, all of them had noticed the weight that seemed to hang over him. Ethan was distracted. He wasn't the efficient, unflappable man he used to be. Helena approached him one evening in the grand living room of his penthouse, her expression sharp. You're not yourself lately, Ethan. What's going on? She was sitting on the plush sofa, legs crossed, a glass of wine in her hand. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the city lights that sparkled below like 1,000 tiny stars. He didn't want to tell her. He wasn't ready to explain to Helena how his life had been irrevocably altered, how everything he had once believed to be true had been turned upside down. But Helena was no fool. Is it about that woman? She asked, her tone low, but with a venom that made Ethan freeze. Ava, right? He turned to face her, the weight of the truth pressing heavily on his chest. It's about Leo, he said softly. Helena's eyes narrowed. What does Leo have to do with anything? Ethan took a deep breath, stepping closer. Ava came back, Helena. With a child. Helena's face turned pale, the glass of wine slipping from her fingers and spilling across the polished surface of the coffee table. She didn't even seem to notice. Leo is mine, Ethan continued, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. I have a son. Helena's hands clenched into fists. How could you let this happen, Ethan? How could you let this happen? I didn't know, Ethan replied, his voice strained. I didn't know until now. Helena stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. What do you want me to do, Ethan? What do you expect from me now? The words were harsh, but they were also full of desperation. Ethan understood them, perhaps better than he wanted to. He had never wanted this to happen. He had never expected to be in this position, to be torn between his past and his present, to face the consequences of a decision he had made without fully understanding its weight. I don't know what I expect from you, Helena, he said quietly. I just want to be a part of his life. Helena laughed, but there was no humor in it. And what does that mean for us, Ethan? Do you think this can just go back to the way it was? That I can sit by and watch you play happy family with Ava and your son while I stand here, helpless? Ethan's heart sank. He had never wanted this, to hurt Helena, to tear apart the life they had built together. But it was already too late. The foundation had cracked, and there was no fixing it. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. Helena shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It's too late for that, Ethan. You made your choice a long time ago. She paused, her gaze steady, as if weighing every word. And now you have to live with the consequences. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts, with the weight of his past, and with the realization that there was no going back. The next day, Ava sent him a message, brief, to the point. I think Leo would like to meet you. If you're ready. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure he was prepared for it. What if Leo didn't want anything to do with him? What if the boy was too young to even understand who he was? Or worse, what if he did understand and rejected him entirely? But there was no turning back. He had to face the consequences of his actions, for better or worse. He replied, his fingers trembling slightly on the screen. When and where? Ava's response came quickly. Tomorrow, in the park near my apartment. 3 p.m. Don't be late. Ethan spent the next 24 hours in a blur. He couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't focus on anything other than the upcoming meeting. His mind kept racing through all the worst-case scenarios. Leo refusing to speak to him, Ava turning him away, or worse yet, him realizing that he was no more than an intruder in their lives. He arrived at the park early, his heart hammering in his chest as he stood near the fountain, watching as parents and children played around him. For a moment, it felt surreal. This wasn't a world he had ever been a part of. His life had always been about power, control, and success. But now it was about something entirely different, something he didn't fully understand yet. Ava arrived with Leo, her eyes scanning the area before landing on Ethan. She looked tired, but there was a calmness in her demeanor that gave him pause. She had always been strong, but now she seemed to carry the weight of years of struggle and resilience. Leo, on the other hand, was a small, blonde boy who looked up at Ethan with an almost cautious curiosity. When they reached him, Ava didn't say a word. She simply nodded at Leo, and the boy, still holding her hand, took a tentative step toward Ethan. Ethan crouched down to his level, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Hey there, Leo," he said gently. Leo hesitated, then finally spoke in a soft voice. "Are you my daddy?" The question hit Ethan like a tidal wave, his throat closing up as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. He had no answer. Not a simple one, anyway. I am, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm your daddy." Leo studied him for a long time, as if searching for something in his face, something that would make this truth feel real. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the boy smiled, tentatively, but a smile nonetheless. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something more than regret. He felt a glimmer of hope. The days following the encounter at the park were a whirlwind. Ethan couldn't quite put into words the emotions that had surged through him as Leo had looked into his eyes and finally accepted him. It was a quiet moment, but it was the most significant thing that had ever happened to him. For once, the world of business, the empire he had worked so hard to build, seemed insignificant in comparison to the small boy who had just begun to understand the concept of family. Ethan wasn't sure what to expect after that day. He had started to imagine a life with Leo, a future where he could be a father, but the reality was much more complicated. There were no clear answers, no simple fixes to the years of pain and abandonment. Ava hadn't opened up fully to him yet, still guarded by the wounds he had inflicted upon her. Ava had allowed him small steps into Leo's life, but she hadn't exactly welcomed him with open arms. He respected her space, understanding that trust needed to be rebuilt slowly. But with every visit, every hour he spent with Leo, the connection between them grew stronger. Ethan watched as his son blossomed, slowly beginning to trust him, to smile at him with genuine affection. It was a slow process, but it was progress. One afternoon, after one of their outings to the zoo, Ava asked him if he would like to stay for dinner. The offer was unexpected, but it was a sign that she was beginning to soften. "I'll make pasta," she said as they stood outside her apartment. "It's Leo's favorite." Ethan couldn't help but smile. He had never expected to be invited into this simple, domestic world. He had spent so many years focused on what he could achieve, what he could buy, that he had never considered what it meant to be truly present in someone's life. As they sat at the small dining table, Leo chattered on about the animals he had seen, and Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest. He didn't need anything grand. He didn't need the luxury or the accolades. He just needed this. He needed to be part of this family, part of their world. Ava was quiet, focused on her food, but there was a softness in her expression. She didn't say much, but there was no distance between them. For the first time since their separation, Ethan felt like they were sharing something real, something unspoken. After dinner, as they cleared the table together, Ethan found himself once again at a crossroads. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, but he knew he couldn't move forward without facing it. Ava deserved more than just his apologies. She deserved answers, honesty, and most of all, a commitment that he wasn't just here to play the role of a father when it suited him. "Ava," he said quietly, standing by the sink as she rinsed off the dishes. "I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you. And I'm here for Leo." She paused, looking at him over her shoulder. There was something unreadable in her eyes, but she didn't say anything at first. The room was filled with the soft clinking of plates and the hum of the dishwasher, but there was an unspoken tension hanging between them. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't expect you to come back, Ethan. I didn't expect anything from you." Her voice was low, steady. "But I've had to carry the weight of everything alone for so long. And now, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to believe anymore." Ethan felt the truth of her words like a punch to the gut. He had left them both, without a second thought. He had assumed that time would heal everything, that his success, his wealth, would somehow make everything better. But it hadn't. He had failed her in ways he couldn't undo. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. I want to show you that I'm not the man I was. That I can be the father Leo needs, and the partner you deserve." Ava shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I don't know if I can believe that, Ethan. It's not just about what you say. It's about what you've shown me. And for so long, you didn't show me anything." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew she was right. She had every right to doubt him, to question whether he could change. His actions had spoken louder than any words he could say now. But he was determined. "I can prove it to you," he said quietly. "Just give me a chance." Ava didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Ethan thought he had lost her for good. But then slowly she nodded. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was a crack in the wall she had built, a crack that gave him hope. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to prove himself. He was there for Leo, attending his school events, taking him to playdates, becoming a constant in his son's life. With every small moment, every smile from Leo, Ethan felt the weight of the past lifting, piece by piece. But it wasn't just about Leo anymore. Ethan had begun to see the world differently, through the eyes of a man who had made mistakes, who had hurt people he loved, but who was now determined to make things right. He had been so focused on building his empire, but now he was focused on building something far more important, his family. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, watching a movie with Leo between them, Ava spoke again, her voice soft. "I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, Ethan. But maybe we can start something new. Together." Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that for the first time in years, he was ready to face it. Not with arrogance, not with pride, but with humility and love. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly be a family.